Picture this. It's the summer of 1942. A convoy of battered Chevrolet trucks emerges from the Libyan desert like ghosts, materializing from another dimension. The men inside haven't bathed in weeks. Their beards are wild, their skin burned to leather by the relentless North African sun. They're wearing Arab headscarves and sandals instead of standard military issue. To the Italian sentries watching in disbelief, these apparitions seem to have materialized from thin air, appearing where no human being should possibly exist, hundreds of miles behind enemy lines, in the vast emptiness of the Sahara. These were the men of the Long-Range Desert Group, and the skills they mastered, the techniques they pioneered, the very science of navigating by the sun they developed, would soon be passed on to American soldiers who had never set foot in a desert. This is the story of how a handful of British and Commonwealth soldiers changed the face of modern warfare, and how their hard-won knowledge helped transform Green American troops into the elite fighting force that would help turn the tide of the Second World War. Before we dive deeper into this incredible story, if you're enjoying this content, take a moment to hit that subscribe button and click the bell icon so you never miss another video. And if this story captures your imagination the way it has mine, drop a comment below sharing which aspect of the LRDG you'd like to learn more about. Our story begins not in the chaos of war, but in the peaceful years before it, with a man whose name would become synonymous with desert exploration. Ralph Alger Bagnold was born in 1896 in Devonport, England. His father was a royal engineer, and young Ralph would follow in his footsteps, but he would forge a path unlike any other. After surviving the trenches of the First World War, Bagnold studied engineering at Cambridge, completing his degree in just 2 years. By the mid-1920s, he found himself posted to Egypt with the Royal Corps of Signals, and it was there that his life would take an extraordinary turn. While other British officers spent their leave time enjoying the social clubs of Cairo or the beaches of Alexandria, Bagnold became fascinated by something far less glamorous but infinitely more mysterious. The desert called to him with an almost magnetic pull. At first, he simply wanted to see what lay beyond the known routes, beyond the boundaries of the mapped world. With a small group of like-minded officers and a few Model T Fords, Bagnold began exploring the vast expanses of the Libyan desert. What he discovered would change everything. The desert wasn't just sand and rock. It was a world unto itself, with its own rules, its own physics, its own deadly beauty. Bagnold learned that the immense sand seas that had stopped travelers for millennia weren't actually impassable. They just required understanding. He discovered that by reducing tire pressure, vehicles could float over soft sand that would otherwise swallow them whole. He learned that driving at speed over sand dunes was actually safer than crawling, as momentum carried you over the crests before the sand could drag you down. But it was navigation that truly captured his engineer's mind. In a landscape without landmarks, without trees, without anything to distinguish one mile from the next, how could one find their way? Magnetic compasses were useless in moving vehicles, thrown off by the metal of the engine and the iron-rich rock deposits scattered across the desert floor. Bagnold needed something better, and so he invented it. The Bagnold Sun Compass was a deceptively simple device. It consisted of a horizontal disc mounted on the dashboard of a vehicle. A vertical needle cast a shadow onto the disc, which was graduated with 360 degrees of bearing. The key innovation was that the disc could be rotated to match the sun's azimuth, its position in the sky at any given moment. Using tables that calculated the sun's position based on date and latitude, a navigator could constantly track their true bearing, even while the vehicle bounced and swayed over rough terrain. It sounds simple, but it was revolutionary. Previous sun compasses required the vehicle to stop every time the driver changed course, so the compass could be reset. In rough desert terrain, Where avoiding obstacles meant constant course changes, this made navigation painfully slow. Bagnold's compass allowed continuous navigation at speed. A skilled navigator could keep a running tally of bearing and distance, plotting their route in real time, even when weaving through sand dunes or rocky outcrops. By 1932, Bagnold and his companions had achieved something remarkable. They completed the first recorded east-to-west crossing of the Libyan desert, covering over 1,000 miles through terrain that had never seen a motor vehicle. In 1935, the Royal Geographical Society awarded him their Founder's Medal for his explorations. He wrote papers on the physics of blown sand that were so groundbreaking they would later be used by NASA to study the dunes of Mars. The Bagnold Dunes on the Martian surface bear his name to this day. But in 1939, all of that seemed like a distant hobby. War had broken out in Europe, and Bagnold, now in his early 40s, was recalled to active service. The British Army, with its typical efficiency at misusing talent, bundled him aboard a troop ship bound for Kenya, a posting that would have wasted his unique desert expertise entirely. Then fate intervened. The troop ship was involved in a collision in the Mediterranean. The damage forced it to dock at Alexandria for repairs, and Bagnold found himself back in Egypt, surrounded by the very desert he had explored so extensively. And then, on June 10, 1940, everything changed. Italy declared war on Britain. Suddenly, North Africa wasn't just a colonial backwater, it was a theater of war. Italian forces in Libya, over 200,000 strong, threatened Egypt, the Suez Canal, and Britain's vital lifeline to its empire. Bagnold immediately understood both the danger and the opportunity. The Italians held the coastal strip where the fighting would be most intense, but they had no knowledge of and no interest in the vast desert interior. That desert, which the Italians believed to be an impassable barrier on their southern flank, was actually a highway for anyone who knew how to use it. Bagnold requested an immediate meeting with General Archibald Wavell, the Commander-in-Chief of Middle East Command. Wavell was himself no stranger to unconventional thinking. He had been a liaison officer in the desert during the First World War and understood the value of irregular warfare. When Bagnold laid out his proposal, a small, highly mobile force that could operate deep behind Italian lines for weeks at a time, Wavell didn't hesitate. "I want you to start right away," Wavell said. He gave Bagnold 6 weeks to prepare. It was an impossibly tight timeline to create an entirely new type of military unit from scratch, but Bagnold had been preparing for this moment for over a decade, even if he hadn't known it. The first challenge was finding the right men. Bagnold didn't want typical soldiers. He rejected the idea of recruiting aggressive, death-or-glory types. Instead, he wanted men who were self-reliant, mentally tough, patient, and practical. Men who could repair a broken axle in the middle of nowhere with limited tools. Men who could endure weeks of isolation in brutal conditions without losing their composure or their judgment. General Wavell suggested he look to the New Zealand Division, which had recently arrived in Egypt but was temporarily without its heavy equipment, which had been lost at sea. Bagnold liked the idea immediately. New Zealand farmers, he reasoned, would have exactly the qualities he needed. They were used to isolation, to improvising repairs, to enduring harsh conditions with quiet competence. He approached Lieutenant General Bernard Freyberg, the legendary commander of the New Zealand Division. Freyberg, a massive man covered in battle scars from the First World War, was initially hostile to the idea. He guarded his men fiercely and didn't want to lose his best soldiers to some experimental unit. But Bagnold was persuasive, and Wavell's backing carried weight. Freyberg agreed to let Bagnold recruit volunteers. When the call went out, over half the entire New Zealand Division volunteered. Bagnold carefully selected 2 officers and 85 other ranks, including administrative and technical personnel. These New Zealanders would form the core of what was initially called the Long Range Patrol, soon to be renamed the Long Range Desert Group. The next challenge was equipment. Bagnold chose Chevrolet 30 CW trucks for their proven durability in desert conditions. They weren't fast, getting only about 6 miles to the gallon, but they could take punishment. Each truck was stripped of everything non-essential to save weight. They were fitted with sand channels and canvas mats for getting unstuck, condensers to recapture water from boiling radiators, and of course Bagnold's sun compasses on the dashboards. For weapons, the LRDG went beyond standard Army issue. They acquired surplus Royal Air Force Lewis guns and later Vickers K machine guns, which had been designed for aircraft and had a devastatingly high rate of fire. Some trucks mounted multiple guns in pairs, creating mobile fire platforms that could pour out over 2,000 rounds per minute. They also carried Boy's anti-tank rifles and later mounted captured Italian 20mm Breda guns. But the most important equipment was navigational. Each patrol needed theodolites for fixing their position by the stars at night. They needed air almanacs for calculating celestial positions. They needed the Bagnold sun compasses, which Bagnold had to borrow back from the Egyptian army since the British Army had never adopted his invention. The training was intense but focused. Under Bagnold's instruction, the New Zealand volunteers learned desert survival techniques. They learned to navigate by sun and stars. They learned to read tracks in the sand, to identify how many vehicles had passed and when. They learned to conserve water, surviving on just 6 pints per day, in temperatures that could reach 120 degrees in the shade. They learned to maintain their vehicles under impossible conditions, to improvise repairs with whatever materials were at hand. One of the navigators-to-be turned out to be Private Dick Croucher, who revealed he was actually a former merchant Navy officer with a first mate's ticket. Like many skilled men in the ranks, he had hidden his qualifications for fear of being reassigned to a ship instead of serving with his mates. His navigational expertise proved invaluable. Within those 6 weeks, 3 patrols were ready. Each patrol consisted of about 30 men in 10 trucks, with a lighter vehicle for the patrol commander. They were required to be completely self-sufficient for at least 1,500 cross-country miles and at least 3 weeks, carrying all their own fuel, water, food, ammunition, and spare parts. Nothing like this had ever been attempted before in military history. In August 1940, the Long Range Patrol launched its first operation. 2 patrols crossed over 4,000 miles through territory no Army vehicle had ever traversed. They scouted Italian outposts, survived the paralyzing heat of day and the freezing cold of night, and successfully rendezvoused at a predetermined location deep in the desert. The operation proved that Bagnold's concept wasn't just feasible, but could be devastatingly effective. The Italians were utterly unprepared for what came next. To them, the raiders seemed to appear from nowhere, as if from a fourth dimension. The LRDG would plant mines on roads, ambush convoys, and roar out of the night onto enemy bases with machine guns blazing. One unit actually drove up an enemy-held road past Italian and German vehicles, without anyone paying them attention because the Axis forces also used captured British trucks. The raiders simply looked like they belonged there. The LRDG planted mines that destroyed supply trucks. They attacked airfields, destroying aircraft on the ground. They gathered intelligence about enemy movements and strengths. And always, after their raids, they vanished back into the vast emptiness of the desert, leaving the enemy looking over their shoulders, never knowing where the next strike would come from. Word spread quickly about these extraordinary desert warriors. The unit was officially renamed the Long Range Desert Group, and volunteers from Rhodesia, South Africa, and British units soon joined. The LRDG never numbered more than 350 men, but their impact was vastly disproportionate to their size. The living conditions were brutal beyond anything most soldiers experienced. Water rationing was severe. Men couldn't wash for weeks. They lived on a special ration scale that Bagniold had fought hard to get approved, one that included their daily rum ration, something the rest of the Army hadn't seen since the First World War. Their uniforms deteriorated into rags. They wore Arab headscarves for protection against sun and sand. Their standard Army boots, which filled with sand, were replaced with chaplis, Indian frontier sandals made to special order. When they returned to Cairo, after weeks in the desert, they looked like something out of the Old Testament. As historian Saul Kelly wrote, the men of the LRDG patrols were quite a sight on their return from a month's trip to Libya. Unwashed, bearded, burnt brown by the sun and clad in ragged shirts, shorts, and sandals, they had the air about them of a bunch of wild-eyed biblical hermits emerging from their sojourn in the wilderness. But the harshness of their existence masked a deadly professional competence. The LRDG became so expert in desert navigation that they earned a reputation for supernatural precision. As historian Brigadier Julian Thompson noted, they were utterly reliable. If they said they would arrive at an exact spot in the desert 1,000 miles away at a certain time, they almost invariably did. This reliability made them invaluable for guiding other units. In late 1941, a young officer named David Sterling had formed a new unit called L Detachment of the Special Air Service Brigade. Sterling's idea was to use small teams of parachute-trained soldiers to raid enemy airfields. His first operation was a disaster. Dropped by parachute in terrible weather, 22 of his 65 men were either eliminated or captured without achieving their objective. But Sterling was given a second chance, and this time he relied on the LRDG. On December 8, 1941, 20 men from the LRDG took 2 SAS raiding parties to attack airfields at Tamat and Sirte. The group successfully destroyed 24 aircraft. Later missions saw even more success, with 37 aircraft destroyed at the Agadabia airfield and 27 more at Tamat. The SAS would become famous in their own right, but they readily acknowledged their debt to the LRDG. Jack Mann, one of the last surviving members of the LRDG, recalled that they were viewed as the taxi service because they can take you anywhere. They knew the desert. Perhaps the LRDG's most vital contribution was their road watch operations. Beginning in March 1942, patrols took up concealed positions along the main road from Tripoli to Benghazi, the primary Axis supply route. Hidden in camouflaged positions, sometimes just 300 yards from the road, LRDG observers would record every vehicle that passed, noting the type, whether it was a tank, a truck, an armored car, the direction, and the time. The intelligence was invaluable. General Montgomery's staff could assess German intentions based on the traffic patterns. An increase in fuel trucks heading toward the front might indicate a coming offensive. A stream of ambulances heading back might suggest the enemy had suffered heavy casualties. From March 2 to July 21, 1942, the road was under constant observation. The LRDG operated a 3-patrol rotation system, with 1 patrol on watch, 1 en route to relieve them, and 1 back at base, being debriefed and resupplied. Now, while the LRDG was perfecting the art of desert warfare in North Africa, something equally significant was happening thousands of miles away. The United States had entered the war after Pearl Harbor, and American military planners knew that their first major ground engagement against Germany would likely come in North Africa. The problem was that American soldiers had never trained for desert warfare, and the handful of officers who had experience in harsh environments had gained it in places like the jungles of the Philippines or the forests of the American Northwest. The British, by contrast, had been fighting in the desert since 1940. They had learned hard lessons about desert warfare, lessons written in blood, and they had the LRDG, perhaps the most expert desert warriors in the world. In the spring of 1942, 2 parallel developments began to intersect. First, American military planners began looking seriously at creating elite units modeled on British Special Forces. Colonel Lucian Truscott proposed training American soldiers with British commandos, then dispersing them among regular units to provide a cadre of battle-experienced personnel. Truscott chose the name Rangers for these new battalions, harking back to Rogers Rangers from the French and Indian Wars. Second, the American Army recognized they needed to train troops specifically for desert warfare. General George S. Patton was assigned to establish what would become the Desert Training Center in the Mojave and Sonoran deserts. The timing wasn't coincidental. The Americans knew they would be fighting in North Africa, and they needed to learn fast. On June 7, 1942, the 1st Ranger Battalion was officially formed in Northern Ireland. Its commanding officer was a young artillery officer from Arkansas named William Orlando Darby. Darby was lean, energetic, and ambitious. He had been serving as an aide, but had been itching for a combat command. When the call came for volunteers to form the Rangers, he jumped at the chance. The battalion was composed entirely of volunteers, mostly from the 34th Infantry Division and the 1st Armored Division. Of the 1,500 men who volunteered, only 600 were selected. Darby was looking for men with initiative, physical toughness, and the ability to think on their feet. These weren't going to be garrison soldiers following rigid drill. These were going to be warriors who could operate independently in the most challenging conditions. By mid-July, the 1st Ranger Battalion was on a train heading to Fort William in the Scottish Highlands. Bagpipes of the Cameron Highlanders Band greeted them as they stepped off the train. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Vaughan, a burly, battle-hardened British officer, welcomed them to Scotland. Then he led them on what he called a short walk to their destination. That walk turned out to be a 7-mile forced march through the rugged Scottish countryside, carrying full packs and equipment. It was an intentional test, and it set the tone for what was to come. The destination was Achnacarry Castle, the British Commando Training Depot. For the next 3 months, the American Rangers would be pushed harder than they had ever been pushed in their lives. The British commandos who served as instructors were veterans of actual combat operations. They had raided enemy-held coastlines, fought in Norway, and conducted operations that had taught them exactly what it took to survive behind enemy lines. The British commandos did all in their power to test us to find out what sort of men we were, Darby later recalled. Then, apparently liking us, they did all in their power to prepare us for battle. The training was brutally realistic in a way that was unprecedented for American forces. Live ammunition was used routinely. Machine gun fire would crack overhead as Rangers crossed obstacle courses. Explosives would detonate nearby during training exercises. 500 of the 600 volunteers completed the training. One Ranger was fatally wounded, and several others were injured by live fire. It was a stark reminder that the skills they were learning weren't theoretical. They were a matter of life and death. The Rangers learned close quarters combat, knife fighting, and what were euphemistically called silent approaches, methods of eliminating enemy sentries without raising an alarm. They learned demolitions, how to set charges to destroy bridges, buildings, and aircraft. They learned patrolling techniques, how to move through enemy territory unseen and unheard. They practiced night operations extensively, understanding that darkness would be their ally. But what they learned went far beyond simple combat skills. The British commandos taught them the philosophy of special operations. They learned that small groups of highly trained men could achieve objectives that larger conventional forces could not. They learned the value of surprise, speed, and violence of action. They learned that planning was essential, but that the ability to improvise when plans fell apart was even more important. And crucially, they learned navigation techniques. The British had developed sophisticated methods of moving through unfamiliar territory, maintaining orientation even in complete darkness, or in landscapes without obvious landmarks. These techniques had been refined through operations in Norway, in the Mediterranean, and in North Africa. The LRDG's pioneering work in desert navigation was part of this broader body of knowledge that the British Special Forces community shared. In August 1942, 50 Rangers got their first taste of actual combat. They were attached to the disastrous raid on Dieppe, France. It was a baptism of fire that ended with nearly half the attacking force eliminated or captured. The Rangers who participated learned firsthand the brutal reality of combat, but they also learned the consequences of poor planning and insufficient intelligence. It was a lesson that would serve them well in the months to come. While the Rangers were training in Scotland, Patton was building his desert empire in California. The Desert Training Center eventually covered 18,000 square miles, an area larger than Maryland and Delaware combined. It stretched from the outskirts of Pomona, California, eastward to within 50 miles of Phoenix, Arizona, southward to the suburbs of Yuma, and northward into the southern tip of Nevada. Patton's philosophy was straightforward. The California desert can kill quicker than the enemy. We will lose a lot of men from heat, but training will save hundreds of lives when we get into combat. He wasn't exaggerating. The conditions at the Desert Training Center were harsh beyond belief. Temperatures regularly exceeded 110 degrees. Soldiers trained without running water, without electricity, living in massive tent cities laid out in grids 3 miles long by 1 mile wide. Each camp could house 15,000 soldiers at a time, and at its peak, the Desert Training Center had 12 such camps operating simultaneously. The terrain mimicked what soldiers would face in North Africa. One Army official remarked, "The terrain at the Desert Training Center is far worse than anything in Libya or Mesopotamia. American troops at the center are more competent to go into battle today than any unit with which I have served." Arbouri. Soldiers underwent demanding day and night marches with limited water and food. They practiced living off limited supplies, maintaining equipment in harsh conditions, and conducting operations in extreme heat. They learned desert driving techniques, some of which came directly from British experience. The technique of reducing tire pressure for soft sand, which Bagnold had pioneered in the 1920s, became standard practice for American forces. The military systematically mapped the entire Mojave Desert, creating detailed topographic maps that would later be used by civilians. Navigation techniques were taught using sun compasses and celestial navigation, methods that bore a striking similarity to what the LRDG had perfected. While there's no direct documentation of LRDG personnel training American troops at the Desert Training Center, the flow of knowledge from British desert warfare experience to American forces was undeniable. By mid-1942, the convergence of all these efforts began to bear fruit. Over 1 million American soldiers would eventually train at the Desert Training Center. The 1st Ranger Battalion had completed its commando training and was ready for action. And plans were underway for Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of French North Africa, scheduled for November 1942. The Rangers would spearhead the invasion. In the pre-dawn hours of November 8, 1942, Darby's Rangers conducted their first battalion-sized combat operation. Their objective was the coastal town of Arzew, near Oran in Algeria. 2 coastal defense batteries dominated the landing beaches and had to be eliminated before the main invasion force could land safely. Darby split his force into 2 groups. Major Herman Dammer led one force directly into the port of Arzew to capture Fort de la Pointe. Darby himself led the other force in an amphibious landing on rocky shores, followed by a climb up cliffs to assault the inland Batterie du Nord. Everything they had learned came into play. The night navigation techniques they'd practiced in Scotland guided them through the darkness. The silent approach methods allowed them to get close to enemy positions without detection. The demolitions training helped them quickly disable enemy weapons. The aggressive close-quarters combat techniques overwhelmed the defenders before they could organize resistance. surprise was complete. By 4 in the morning, both positions were in Ranger hands. 50 enemy soldiers had been eliminated, 10 captured, and the guns that could have devastated the invasion fleet were silent. The Rangers had taken minimal casualties and had opened the door for the main invasion force. The success at Arzew established the Rangers' reputation. The Italians, terrified by the speed and ferocity of the Ranger attacks, dubbed them the Black Death. As the North African campaign continued, the Rangers proved their worth again and again. In March 1943, when American units were being devastated trying to break through the critical mountain pass at Jebel Ankh, the Rangers were given the mission. They undertook a 12-mile night march through rugged terrain, using the navigation techniques they'd learned to find their way through landscapes with few landmarks. At dawn, they surprised the enemy from the rear, capturing 200 prisoners and giving General Patton an opening through which he began the final and victorious battle in North Africa. Meanwhile, the LRDG was achieving one of their most significant successes of the entire war. In early January 1943, as the Axis forces retreated toward Tunisia, they fell back to the Mareth Line, a defensive position that the French had built in the 1930s to keep the Italians out of Tunisia. The line was formidable, running about 22 miles from the Mediterranean Sea to the Matmata Mountains. It featured concrete blockhouses, steel cupolas, and the natural obstacle of the Wadi Zigzau, a dry riverbed with banks up to 70 feet high in places. Montgomery's 8th Army needed to break through this line to continue their advance and link up with American forces coming from the west. But the terrain was daunting. A frontal assault would be costly, and the mountain barrier on the flank seemed to preclude any outflanking movement. Enter the LRDG. A patrol was sent out to scout the supposedly impassable terrain west of the Matmata Mountains. Using their unparalleled navigation skills and their intimate knowledge of desert travel, the LRDG found what others had missed. They discovered a pass through the Jebel Dahar Mountains that was subsequently named Wilder's Gap after the patrol leader. A later patrol pushed even further, penetrating through the Tabaga Gap and proving that the route was practicable for a large military force. The implications were enormous. If a force could move through these gaps, they could emerge behind the Mareth Line, cutting off the defenders and making their position untenable. The LRDG patrol even pushed further north to Gafsa and made contact with the American forces advancing from the west. They had proved that the 8th Army's right flank could link up with the American left. Armed with this intelligence, Montgomery planned Operation Pugilist. The main attack would be a frontal assault, but simultaneously, a flanking force built around the 2nd New Zealand Division would move through the mountains via Wilder's Gap. When the frontal assault stalled under heavy resistance from the 15th Panzer Division, Montgomery adapted his plan. He shifted his main effort to the flanking movement, now designated Operation Supercharge II. The New Zealand Corps, guided by LRDG pathfinders, executed a remarkable feat. They marched their entire division, including the 8th Armored Brigade, through the mountain passes in night marches, remaining hidden from Axis aerial reconnaissance. On March 26th, they broke through the Tabaga Gap and threatened to cut off the entire Mareth Line. The Axis forces had no choice but to retreat. Within 48 hours, they had abandoned the Mareth Line entirely and fallen back 60 kilometers to their next defensive position at Wadi Akarit. It was a stunning example of how a small group of specialists, in this case the LRDG scouts who found the route, could enable a decisive strategic victory. The success at Mareth also meant that British and American forces were now operating in close coordination. The lessons learned by each flowed between them. American forces who had trained at the Desert Training Center found that the techniques they'd practiced, navigation by sun compass, maintaining vehicles in harsh conditions, operating with limited water, were directly applicable to the combat they were facing. The Rangers, meanwhile, continued to distinguish themselves. After North Africa, they participated in the invasion of Sicily and then Italy. At Anzio, however, tragedy struck. The 1st and 3rd Ranger Battalions were assigned to infiltrate behind German lines and capture the town of Cisterna. Intelligence had underestimated the German strength in the area, and the Rangers walked into a trap. Of the 767 men who went in, only 7 came back. Most were captured or eliminated. It was a devastating loss that effectively ended Derby's Rangers as a fighting force. But their legacy lived on. The 2nd and 5th Ranger Battalions carried the banner on D-Day, with the 2nd Rangers famously scaling the cliffs of Pointe du Hoc to destroy German gun emplacements. The 6th Ranger Battalion fought in the Pacific, conducting operations in the Philippines. The LRDG-2 continued to operate after North Africa. Following the Axis surrender in Tunisia in May 1943, the unit was redeployed to the Mediterranean, conducting operations in the Greek islands, Italy, and the Balkans. They were dropped behind enemy lines north of Rome to gather intelligence on German troop movements. They conducted raids in Yugoslavia, destroying railway bridges and disrupting German supply lines. They operated in Albania, following the German retreat and assisting resistance fighters. But with the end of the war in Europe approaching, the LRDG's leaders submitted a request to transfer the unit to the Far East to continue operations against Japan. The request was declined, and in August 1945, the Long Range Desert Group was disbanded. Never more than 350 men, they had conducted over 200 missions, operated constantly behind enemy lines for years, and suffered remarkably few casualties considering the danger of their operations. Their influence, however, extended far beyond their service record. The techniques they pioneered became standard for special operations forces worldwide. The Australian Special Air Service and New Zealand Special Air Service were both influenced by LRDG veterans who returned home with their hard-won expertise. In Britain, the SAS Mobility Troop carries on the tradition of long-range desert patrolling to this day. And in America, the impact was equally profound. The Special Forces units that emerged from the war, the ancestors of today's Army Rangers, Green Berets, and Delta Force, all trace their lineage back to the cross-pollination of ideas that occurred during those critical years. The philosophy of small unit operations, the emphasis on navigation and fieldcraft, the ability to operate independently far from support, all of these were lessons learned and shared between British and American forces. The science of navigating by the sun, which Bagnoli had perfected while exploring the Libyan desert in the 1920s, had become a fundamental skill for special operations forces. The techniques of living and fighting in harsh environments, which the LRDG had mastered through years of operations, were incorporated into training programs for elite units around the world. Ralph Bagnold himself returned to scientific work after the war. He was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society, a rare honor for a military officer without formal academic qualifications. He continued publishing research papers into his 90s, contributing to our understanding of sand movement, sedimentology, and beach formation. When NASA began studying the surface of Mars, they turned to Bagnold's work on desert dunes. The Bagnold Dunes on Mars are named in his honor. In his later years, Bagnold reflected on how his pre-war hobby had become so consequential. Never in our peacetime travels had we imagined that war could ever reach the enormous, empty solitudes of the inner desert, he wrote, walled off by sheer distance, lack of water, and impassable seas of sand dunes. Little did we dream that any of the special equipment and techniques we evolved for long-distance travel and for navigation would ever be put to serious use. But put to serious use they were. The LRDG proved that small groups of highly trained specialists could achieve effects far out of proportion to their numbers. They showed that imagination and expertise could overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. They demonstrated that the harshest environments, far from being barriers, could become highways for those with the knowledge to use them. Their legacy lives on every time a special operations team navigates through hostile territory, every time soldiers are trained to operate independently far from support, every time the military emphasizes fieldcraft and self-reliance as core competencies. The sun compass that Bagnold invented might have been replaced by GPS satellites, but the principles remain the same. Know where you are, know where you're going, and have the skills to get there no matter what obstacles stand in your way. The story of the LRDG and their influence on American forces is ultimately a story about knowledge and how it flows between people and across borders during times of crisis. When the Americans entered the war, they were smart enough to learn from those who had already been fighting. The British Special Forces community, including the LRDG, had accumulated irreplaceable expertise through years of combat operations. That knowledge was freely shared, taught in training camps in Scotland, demonstrated on desert operations in North Africa, and passed from veteran to newcomer in the timeless tradition of warriors teaching other warriors. The Rangers who trained with British commandos at Achnacarry Castle weren't just learning techniques. They were absorbing a philosophy of warfare that the British had refined through bitter experience. And that philosophy owed much to the LRDG, who had shown what small groups of dedicated men could achieve through expertise, planning, and daring. Today, when American Special Operations Forces train for missions anywhere in the world, they carry forward a tradition that stretches back to those sun-baked Chevrolet trucks rolling through the Libyan desert. The emphasis on navigation, on self-sufficiency, on operating far from support, on using specialized skills to achieve strategic objectives, all of these trace their lineage to the bearded, sandal-wearing warriors of the Long-Range Desert Group. So the next time you read about Special Operations Forces conducting missions behind enemy lines, or see them portrayed in films and documentaries, remember the men who pioneered these techniques. Remember Ralph Bagnold, the scientist-soldier who turned his desert hobby into a revolutionary approach to warfare. Remember the New Zealand farmers who volunteered to drive into the unknown. Remember the Rhodesians and South Africans and British who joined them. Remember their skill with the sun compass, their ability to navigate thousands of miles through featureless terrain, their willingness to endure incredible hardship to get the job done. And remember that when American Rangers landed on the beaches of North Africa, when they climbed the cliffs of Pointe du Hoc, when they conduct missions today in mountains and deserts around the world, they do so standing on the shoulders of those LRDG pioneers who proved that with the right knowledge, the right skills, and the right determination, even the most hostile environment can be mastered. The Long-Range Desert Group may have been disbanded in 1945, but their spirit lives on wherever Special Operations Forces operate. They taught by example that expertise, carefully cultivated and bravely applied, can overcome any obstacle. They showed that the impossible is often just the untried, and they demonstrated that when warriors share knowledge across national boundaries, united in common cause, they become far more powerful than the sum of their parts. That is the true legacy of the LRDG, not just the raids they conducted or the intelligence they gathered, but the knowledge they created and shared. They taught the world how to navigate by the sun, how to thrive in the harshest environments, and how small groups of determined experts can change the course of history. It's a lesson that remains as relevant today as it was in the burning sands of the Sahara over 8 decades ago. If you've made it this far, thank you for taking this journey through history with me. If this story has deepened your appreciation for the unsung heroes of the Second World War, please hit that like button and share this video with others who appreciate military history. Drop a comment below with your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Until next time, keep exploring the past, because it's in understanding where we've been that we learn how far we can go.